The smell hit him first, a thick, greasy wall of rendered beef fat that coated the back of his throat and refused to wash down with the damp river air. Arnold shifted his weight. The mud sucked at his boot with a wet, obscene popping sound, reluctant to yield the ground it had claimed hours ago. Low tide had stripped the barn's foreshore bare, exposing the jagged spine of London's refuse, broken bottles, coal clinkers, the bloated carcass of a rat, and now this. He stood knee-deep in the black sludge, his greatcoat heavy with the mist rolling off the Thames, watching Constable Hatcher wrestle with something wrapped in wax paper half buried in the muck. "Careful with it, Hatcher," Arnold said. His voice came out flat, stripped of urgency, the way he spoke when ordering tea or noting a stolen pocket watch. "Don't tear the paper." Hatcher grunted, a sound of pure physical strain. The constable's gloves were slick with slime, his fingers scrabbling for purchase on the parcel as if it were a live eel trying to worm its way back into the silt. The fog muffled the usual clatter of the river, the distant chug of a steamer, the cry of gulls fighting over scrapser, leaving only the squelch of boots and the ragged pull of breath. Hatcher yanked. The parcel shifted. Then, with a soft, wet rupture, the wax paper gave way. Steam rose from the tier, not the grey vapor of the fog, but a sharp, white plume that carried the heat of a kitchen stove straight into the chill of the March morning. It smelled of Sunday dinner, of a pot left simmering too long on a range, rich and cloying, but underneath that domestic warmth lay the coppery tang of old blood. Arnold did not flinch. He had trained himself out of flinching 3 cases ago when he'd pulled a child from the Regent's Canal with the waterlogged rope still around its neck. Instead, he stepped closer, the mud sucking at his other leg now, and peered down. "What is it, sir?" Hatcher asked, wiping his hands on his trousers and leaving dark streaks across the wool. "Fish." "No fish has a femur, Constable." Arnold crouched, ignoring the protest of his knees and the way the damp seeped through his trousers to chill the bone. He reached out, his large red-knuckled hand hovering over the exposed contents. It was a section of thigh, the skin sloughing off like wet parchment left in the rain, revealing the muscle beneath which had been cooked to a pale, fibrous grey. The sight was not shocking in its violence. There was no blood, no jagged tear of a struggle. It was shocking in its preparation. This had been done with care. Someone had taken the time to strip the flesh, to boil it until it separated cleanly from the structure, to wrap it as one might wrap a joint of meat for a butcher's display. Dr. Phillips arrived then, navigating the treacherous slope of the bank with the precarious grace of a man more accustomed to lecture halls than tidal flats. He carried his black bag in one hand, using a cane to probe the mud ahead of him. "Arnold," Phillips said, breathless, his cheeks flushed pink against the grey backdrop. "They told me at the station you'd found something substantial." "Substantial enough," Arnold replied, standing up and brushing a speck of mud from his cuff. "Look at the separation, Doctor, the ligaments." Phillips knelt, disregarding the ruin of his trousers, and leaned in. He pulled a small magnifying lens from his pocket, squinting through the glass. The silence stretched, filled only by the lap of water against the pilings further down the shore. "Clean," Phillips muttered, more to himself than to Arnold. "Very clean, no saw marks on the bone ends. This wasn't hacked. It was dissolved, boiled until the periosteum surrendered." He looked up, his eyes wide and watery behind his spectacles. "Whoever did this knew exactly how long to keep the pot on the fire. Too little time and the flesh sticks. Too much and it turns to jelly. This is precise." Arnold felt a familiar tightness in his stomach, a cold knot that had nothing to do with the river air. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his notebook, the leather cover damp and swollen. He uncapped his pen, the nib scratching against the paper as he began to dictate, his voice maintaining that same dry monotone. Item 1, portion of human lower limb left side, approximate weight 2 pounds, condition, boiled, stripped of epidermis, wrapped in common wax paper, greased. He paused, the pen hovering. Note, odor consistent with rendered animal fat. Beef likely. "Beef," Phillips echoed, rising to wipe his lens with a handkerchief. It was a deliberate choice, meant either to mask the scent during disposal or perhaps just a consequence of the cooking method. Did they eat the rest? The question hung in the fog, ugly and unavoidable. Arnold didn't answer. He didn't need to. The absence of the rest of the body was a screaming void in the middle of the mudflats. "Where is the head, Doctor?" Arnold asked, closing the notebook with a snap. Phillips shook his head, looking back down at the steaming parcel. "Not here. If this was the method, the skull would be the hardest to break down. They might have buried it, or thrown it further out, where the tide takes it beyond the mudbanks." "It's always the head," Arnold said, adjusting the cuff of his left glove, pulling the wool down over his wrist with a sharp tug. "They keep the easy parts and hide the difficult ones." He looked at the parcel again. The steam was dissipating now, the heat dying in the cold air, leaving the flesh looking merely old, like something dragged from a larder after a week of neglect. But it was the smell that lingered, clinging to the inside of his nose, coating his tongue. It was the smell of a home, of a kitchen where a meal was being prepared, twisted into something monstrous. "Bag it," Arnold ordered, turning away from the sight. "Take it to the mortuary and keep it cool. And Hatcher. So, search the immediate area, 10 yards out, 10 yards back. If there's one parcel, there's more. They don't stop at one leg." Hatcher nodded, already reaching for the shovel. Arnold began the climb back up the bank, his boots sliding in the slick clay, each step a battle against the gravity of the place. He needed to get back to solid ground, to the pavement where the coal dust was dry and the air smelled of smoke rather than stewed human remains. He needed to write the report. He needed to fill the lines in the ledger until the blank spaces were gone. As he crested the bank, his foot caught on something hard embedded in the mud near the high tide line. He stumbled, catching himself on a rotting post, and looked down. Caught on a protruding nail was a scrap of fabric, dark and soaked through, tangled with the roots of the marsh grass. Arnold crouched again, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for it. He pulled it free. It was coarse calico, dyed a faded blue, the kind of material used for under-petticoats by women who worked in service. He turned it over in his hand. There was a tear in the hem, and stitched into the waistband, almost obliterated by the water, but still legible if one knew where to look, was a mark, a laundry ink stamp. He squinted, bringing the cloth closer to his eyes. The letters were blurred, swollen with damp, but the shape was distinct. R.M. Richmond Market, or perhaps her initials. "Doctor," Arnold called out, his voice sharper now, cutting through the fog. "Come up here." Phillips scrambled up the bank, cane digging into the soft earth. "What is it?" "Clothing," Arnold said, holding the scrap out where it had caught on the nail near the high tide line, for it hadn't been in the water long before it snagged. Phillips took the fabric, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. "Calico, common enough." "Look at the stamp." Phillips held it up to the light. "Initials, JMT." Arnold felt the cold knot in his stomach tighten, hardening into something solid and terrible. He remembered the report from the Richmond station, the one he'd skimmed 3 days ago and filed away as a domestic dispute. A mistress of the house, missing. A maid left in charge. A neighbor complaining about the smell of burning bones. "Julia Martha Thomas," Arnold whispered, the name tasting of ash and fat. "The maid," Phillips said as the realization dawned slowly. "Webster," he added, naming her at last. "Kate Webster." Arnold took the cloth back, folding it carefully into his notebook, pressing it flat against the page where he had just written item 1. The ink was still wet, smudging slightly against the damp fabric. "She didn't just kill her," Arnold said, looking out towards the gray expanse of the river where the fog hid the path to the sea. "She tried to turn her into beef." He turned back towards the path, his stride lengthening, the revulsion hardening into a grim, ritualistic determination. The ledger was no longer just a list of parts. It was a map, and the first coordinate had just been found. "Let's go," he said, not waiting for the doctor to follow. "We have a house to visit." The mud sucked at Arnold's boots as he turned, a wet, sucking kiss that tried to keep him rooted in the slime. He did not look back at the steaming parcel or the constable digging in the muck. Forward, up the bank. The path to the road was a slick ribbon of clay and broken oyster shells, treacherous underfoot, where a misstep meant sliding back into the gray water that lapped hungrily at the shore. Phillips trailed behind, breath coming in short, white puffs, the cane stabbing into the earth for purchase. "Richmond," the doctor said, the word barely audible over the wind picking up off the river. "You mean to go now?" Now, Arnold didn't break stride, urging them forward before the light goes, and before she decides the rest of the butcher's work needs doing. But without a warrant, without the magistrate. Arnold stopped at the top of the bank, wiping his hands on his trousers, though the grease had already soaked through the wool to the skin beneath. He looked at his palms. They were grey, stained with the river's filth, the lines of his fingerprints filled with black silt. He rubbed them together, hard, trying to generate friction, heat, anything to scrub away the memory of the sloughing skin he had just catalogued. "The magistrate sleeps," Arnold said, observing that while the law moves slow, boiling pots move fast. He started walking again, faster this time, his long coat flapping against his calves like a wounded bird. The road was quiet, the fog pressing down so low it brushed the brim of his hat, turning the world into a tunnel of grey wool. A cart rumbled past, the horse's hooves clipping sparks from the flint sets, the driver hunched against the chill, eyes fixed on the patch of road immediately ahead. No one looked at the two men emerging from the mist, one stalking, one stumbling. Arnold's mind raced, skipping over the procedure, the protocol, the proper channels that usually governed his day. He saw instead the kitchen in Richmond. He had been inside houses like it before, where the mistress ruled with a sharp tongue and the maid served with a lowered head, a quiet war fought over dust and dinner times. But this was different. This was not a war of words. This was a war of digestion. She tried to turn her into beef. The thought made his stomach heave, a violent spasm that he swallowed down with a gulp of cold air. He focused on the rhythm of his walking. Left, right, heel, toe. The sound of his own footsteps on the pavement was an anchor, a dry, hard sound that belonged to the world of men and laws, not the wet, sucking world of the foreshore. "Did you see the cut?" Phillips asked, hurrying to catch up, his voice tight as he noted the ligaments were severed clean, not hacked and not in anger. "Inefficiency," Arnold corrected. "She needed them to fit, in the parcel, in the pot." "A cook's knowledge." "A butcher's," Arnold said, "or a maid who has watched the butcher too closely." They reached the cab rank near the station, a solitary hansom waiting, the horse steaming in the cold, its head drooping. Arnold rapped on the side, the sound sharp and impatient. The driver lifted the trap and peered down, his face shadowed by the leather hood. "Richmond," Arnold barked. "The Vineyard, double fare if you don't ask questions." The driver nodded, not needing telling twice. The fare was good, and the destination was solid ground, away from the river's stench. Arnold climbed in, Phillips squeezing in beside him, the leather seat cold and stiff beneath them. As the cab lurched forward, the wheels clattering on the cobbles, Arnold leaned his head back against the squab and closed his eyes. The smell was still there. It wasn't just on his hands, it was in his clothes, in his hair, lodged deep in the mucous membrane of his nose, rendered fat, beef dripping, but underneath, the sweet, cloying note of something that had once been alive. He opened his eyes and stared at his hands again. He pulled the left glove off, snapping the elastic against his wrist, and inspected the skin. It was pale, the knuckles red and raw from the cold, but the cuticles were dark, stained with a grey that no amount of washing would shift today. He pulled the handkerchief from his pocket, white linen crisp. He began to rub the fingers, one by one, thumb, index, middle. The fabric came away grey. He folded it to a clean section and rubbed again. Grey. "Stop it, Arnold," Phillips said softly. "You'll wear the skin off." "It won't come off," Arnold muttered, rubbing harder, the friction burning now. "It's in the pores." "It's the case. It gets in, it stays." Arnold stopped. He balled the handkerchief in his fist and shoved it back into his pocket. He looked out of the small glass window. The fog was thinning slightly as they moved away from the river, the gas lamps appearing like ghostly oranges in the gloom. They were passing through barns, the houses dark and shuttered, the curtains drawn against the evening chill. Somewhere in one of those houses, a family sat around a fire, eating stew. He wondered if they knew, if the smell had drifted on the wind, subtle and deceptive, and settled over their neighborhood like a blanket. If a neighbor had paused, spoon halfway to mouth, and frowned at the taste of their own dinner, sensing something wrong in the richness of the gravy. "Webster," Arnold said, the name tasting bitter. "Kate Webster." "Irish," Phillips supplied. "Strong. The neighbors said she did the work of two men, lifted the coal scuttles, moved the furniture. Strong enough to boil a woman. Strong enough to try. The cab turned a corner, the wheels groaning as they climbed the slight incline towards Richmond. The houses grew larger here, set back from the road, gardens hidden behind high brick walls. Respectability, order, the kind of place where a missing mistress would be noted, eventually, but where a maid's comings and goings were invisible until the dust began to pile up. Arnold felt the knot in his stomach tighten again, a physical pressure against his diaphragm. He thought of the ledger back at the station. Item 1, just the beginning. If the leg was there, wrapped in wax paper and greased like a joint of meat, then the rest was somewhere. In the river, in the ground, or in the ashes of a kitchen fire. And the head? Where is the head? It was the gap in the puzzle, the missing piece that made the picture incomplete. Without it, identification was circumstantial. Without it, the crown of the evidence was cracked. He could feel the weight of it already, the absence of it, a hollow space in the file that would haunt him long after the body was buried. "We arrive," the driver called down, his voice muffled. The cab slowed, the brakes squealing as they pulled up outside a tall, narrow villa. The windows were dark, save for a faint flicker of light on the ground floor behind a heavy curtain, a single eye of firelight watching the street. Arnold pushed the door open and stepped out onto the pavement. The air here was different, cleaner, smelling of coal smoke and damp leaves, not the river's rot. But as he stood there, looking up at the front door, he could have sworn he smelled it again. Faint, sweet, greasy. Coming from the chimney. "Doctor," Arnold said, his voice low, barely a whisper, "stay close and keep your hand near your pocket." "For what?" "For evidence," Arnold lied. He walked up the path, his boots silent on the stone flags, and raised his hand to knock before pausing because he could hear something inside. It was a sound, low and rhythmic, that was neither a voice nor a footstep. A bubble breaking. He knocked, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the quiet street. Silence from within, then the sound of a chair scraping across a floorboard, heavy footsteps approaching the door, slow, deliberate. Arnold tugged the wool of his left gauntlet until it bit into his wrist, then waited. The handle turned. The door opened a crack, the chain still on. A face appeared in the gap. Dark eyes, heavy brow, a smudge of soot on the cheekbone. "Mrs. Thomas isn't receiving," the woman said. Her voice was flat, devoid of warmth, but her eyes darted past Arnold to the doctor, then back again. "Gone away to visit family." "Gone away," Arnold repeated, leaning in close enough to smell the breath behind the door. It smelled of mint, strong mint masking something else, something rich and meaty. "That's odd, because I just found her leg in the mud, Mrs. Webster, and I'd very much like to see the rest of her before supper." The door slammed shut, the chain rattled. Arnold stepped back, looking at the wood. "Break it," he said to the constable who had followed them from the cab, unseen in the shadows. "Now." The constable's boot connected with the lock. Splinters flew inward like shrapnel from a gunshot, scattering across the pristine hallway tiles where a broom had swept only hours before, leaving the dust of the breakage to settle on the quiet domesticity of a home that pretended nothing was wrong. Arnold stepped over the threshold, the smell hitting him not as a wave, but as a physical weight, pressing against the roof of his mouth, thick and yellow as old custard. Dripping tallow, boiled beef. It came from the kitchen. He did not run. Running belonged to panics, and this was procedure. He walked, his boots leaving muddy prints on the scrubbed pine floor, following the scent to its source. The kitchen door stood ajar. Inside, the fire had died down to glowing embers, but the cast-iron pot still sat on the range, lid askew, a dark grease ring staining the trivet beneath it. Arnold lifted the lid with the tip of his pencil. Steam curled out, carrying the sweet, cloying note of rendered human fat mixed with the sharp tang of onions. He lowered the lid. He turned to the constable. "Seize the pot, do not scrape it, wrap it in oilcloth." "So." "Search the ashes, anything bone that didn't fit." Arnold stepped back into the hall. The air there was cooler, scented with lavender water and beeswax, a desperate mask over the rot. He looked at the stairs. Upstairs, a bed would be made. A wardrobe would hold dresses that no longer had a body to fill them. He felt a pressure behind his ribs, a tightness that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the sheer audacity of the domesticity surrounding him. Webster had lived here, cooked here, slept above the evidence. "Take the boxes to the station," Arnold said. "I will follow." He walked out into the night. The fog had thickened again, swallowing the halos of the street lamps, turning the walk to the police station into a blind stumble through grey wool. He did not think about the leg in the river. He did not think about the pot on the fire. He thought about the ledger, the columns, the ink. The mortuary smelled of carbolic and wet stone. Arnold stood at the basin in the corner, the tap running cold. He pumped the soap dispenser until a mound of grey sludge sat in his palm. He scrubbed. Hard. The bristles of the nail brush tore at his cuticles, raising tiny beads of blood that swirled pink into the white enamel of the sink. It did not help. He scrubbed again, the friction burning now, the skin raw and angry. The smell remained. It was not on the surface. It was in the pores, embedded in the whorls of his fingerprints, a ghost of the boiling house that no amount of chemistry could exorcise. He turned off the tap. The silence of the room rushed in, heavy and damp. He dried his hands on the roller towel, the rough fabric catching on the raw patches of skin. He looked at his reflection in the small mirror above the basin. Pale, eyes shadowed, the moustache twitched as his jaw worked. "Inspector." The clerk sat at the table, pen poised over the ledger. The book lay open, the pages stark white, waiting for the black ink of death. Arnold walked to the table. He sat. He adjusted the cuff of his left glove, tugging the wool until it bit into his wrist, a sharp pinch to ground him. "Begin," Arnold said. "Date: March 2nd, 1879. Item 1. Human lower limb, left side, severed at the hip and knee." Arnold watched the pen scratch across the paper. The sound was dry, brittle, like bones snapping underfoot. He looked at the parcel on the table, the wax paper stained with grease. He should look away. He did not. "Condition?" the clerk asked, nib hovering. "Boiled periosteum removed, skin partially detached." Arnold paused, his throat tightening as he reached for the water jug to pour a glass and drink. The water was tepid, tasting of the copper pipe, yet it did not wash the taste of the air away. "Continue," he said. The clerk wrote. The scratch, scratch, scratch continued, a metronome for the dead. Arnold reached for the parcel again. He needed to check the folds. He needed to be sure. He peeled back the wax paper, the grease sticking to his fingertips despite the washing. There, caught in the crease of the flesh, tangled in the remnants of the ligament, was a scrap of fabric, coarse, blue and white check, calico. Arnold picked it up with his tweezers, holding it to the gas light where the pattern emerged distinct and cheap. It was common for a working woman, yet specific. "Addendum," Arnold said. The clerk looked up. "Sir." "Fragment of clothing, attached to remains." "Description." "Blue and white calico, petticoat lining." Arnold's voice did not waver, though his hand held the tweezers steady only by force of will. "Matches the description given by the neighbor in Richmond. Mrs. Stevens said Webster was wearing a petticoat of such pattern when last seen." "She." "Webster or Thomas, the fabric does not speak." Arnold dropped the scrap into a glass vial. He corked it. The sound was a small pop in the quiet room. He looked at the ledger. Item 1, just the beginning. If the leg was here and the pot was in the kitchen, then the rest of the butchered woman was waiting somewhere, in the earth, in the river, or gone entirely. "And the head? Where is the head?" The question sat in the room with them, heavier than the smell of the fat. Without it, the ledger would always have a blank space, a gap in the mathematics of justice. "Finish the entry," Arnold said. He stood up. His chair scraped against the stone floor, a harsh grating noise that made the clerk flinch. "I am going to look at the pot." "Sir, it is late." "The grease will set. I need to see it before it hardens." Arnold walked to the corner where the constable had left the oilcloth bundle, and he unwrapped it to find the iron still warm. When he tilted the pot, a residue of dark fluid sloshed at the bottom, thick and slow. He dipped a finger in, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger until it felt like lard and smelled like dinner. He wiped his hand on his handkerchief. The stain remained. "Lock the door," Arnold said, not turning around. "No one enters, no one leaves." "And the woman, Webster?" Arnold turned. He looked at the clerk, at the pen, at the ledger that tried to make sense of madness with columns and rows. "She is in the house," Arnold said. "Wait for her to come back for her pot." He knew she would not. He knew she would run. But the lie tasted better than the truth, and sometimes, in this city, a lie was the only bait strong enough to catch a killer. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. The smell of the beef fat clung to his coat, to his hair, to the lining of his lungs. He would carry it home. He would carry it to bed. He would wake up tasting it tomorrow. "Inspector." "Leave the light," Arnold said. "The dead do not like the dark." He stepped out into the corridor. The gas jet flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the brickwork. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 2. The sound was muffled by the fog, distant and irrelevant. He began to walk towards the exit, his boots clicking on the flagstones, a rhythmic counterpoint to the scratching of the pen behind him. He needed air. He needed the river. He needed to stand on the foreshore and watch the water move, black and indifferent, washing the banks clean of everything but the things that refused to drown. The calico fragments sat in the glass vial on the table behind him, a small piece of cloth that tied a woman to a pot and a pot to a crime. It was not a head, it was not a name, but it was a start. And for now, in the grey light of the mortuary, it would have to be enough. The smell hit him first, not the river mud this time, but something sharper, chemical and bright, yellow soap. Lie, the aggressive cleanliness of a woman trying to scrub a sin out of the floorboards. Arnold stood on the step of number 2 Vine Road, his hand resting on the cold iron of the railing, and breathed through his mouth to avoid tasting the air. "Inspector." Constable Miller stepped back from the door, his cape heavy with the damp mist rolling off the Thames. He looked young, too young for this sort of house, where the walls held secrets tighter than a miser's fist. "Has anyone entered?" Arnold asked. His voice came out flat, stripped of the fatigue dragging at his eyelids. "Sealed since Monday, sir. Neighbor lady has the key, but she hasn't crossed the threshold. Says she can feel the wrongness of it from the garden." Miller shifted his weight, boots scuffing the stone. "She thinks the place is haunted." "Houses are bricks and mortar, Miller. They don't hold ghosts. They hold grease." Arnold pushed past him. The hallway stretched ahead, narrow and dim, the wallpaper peeling slightly at the seams where the damp had risen from the foundations. Dust motes danced in shafts of grey light filtering through the net curtains, each particle suspended in the stillness like a tiny floating accusation waiting for someone to name it. He walked softly, not out of respect for the dead, but because the floorboards might speak if he listened hard enough. Creaks told him where the weight had been carried. Scratches showed where the furniture had been dragged. He turned left into the kitchen. The room was small, dominated by the range and the copper boiler set into the brickwork. It looked ordinary, a domestic space where meals were prepared and linens washed, except for the floor. The scrubbing marks were visible even in the low light, radial patterns radiating from the copper where a brush had been driven hard against the wood. The grain was raised, bleached pale by the soda, but in the cracks between the planks, the dirt remained, dark, greasy. Arnold knelt. He did not worry about the dust on his trousers. He leaned in close, his nose inches from the wood. The smell of soap was overwhelming here, a cloying sweetness that stuck to the roof of the mouth, but beneath it lay the residue, fat. Human tallow mixed with beef dripping to hide the scent, but the chemistry of the boil had changed it. It smelled of dinner gone wrong. "Did she do this herself?" Arnold asked. He stayed on his knees, tracing the line of a scrub mark with his eye. "The maid, Webster." Miller leaned against the doorframe, keeping his distance from the copper. "Reckon so. Neighbor heard the boiling late. Tuesday night, she said, into the morning." Tuesday, Arnold stood up, his joints clicking with a dry sound that echoed in the quiet room. The tide was low Tuesday night, perfect for carrying parcels to the foreshore without being seen. He moved to the copper, a large vessel, iron-rimmed and deep, designed for heating water for laundry, though now it sat cold and empty. Reaching out, he touched the rim and his finger came away with a smear of black residue. He rubbed it. It felt slick, like oil, but heavier. "Bag it," Arnold said. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his hand. The stain persisted, a grey shadow on the white linen. "The residue, scrape it out, put it in a jar, label it." "Sir," Miller hesitated. "Scrape the copper, the owner won't like that." "The owner is missing, Miller, and the woman who used this pot is likely halfway to Ireland by now. I do not care about the owner's preferences." Arnold turned to face him, his eyes, watery and pale, fixed on the constable with a sudden intensity. "This is where she became unmade. This is where Julia Martha Thomas stopped being a mistress and started becoming evidence. Treat it with respect." Miller nodded, chastened. He stepped forward, pulling a notebook from his tunic. "I'll get the boy to fetch a chisel." "Do it quietly." Arnold walked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the shelves, the stacked plates, and the jar of pickles on the sill. Everything was in its place, yet there was too much order, making it look like a stage set for a play about domestic bliss where the actors had fled mid-scene. He opened a cupboard to find clean linens folded neatly. Opening another revealed cooking utensils, spoons, ladles, and a carving knife. He paused at the knife. It was clean, polished, but the handle was wood, and wood absorbed fluids. He left it. There would be time for the chemists later if they could find anything worth testing. In 1879, science was a blunt instrument compared to the sharp edge of observation. "Miller." "So." The neighbor, Mrs. Dyer. As Arnold closed the cupboard door, the latch clicked. She heard the boiling. "I said the sound kept her awake. Like bones rattling in a sack, she told me." "Bones rattling." Arnold repeated the words, which sounded crude and sensational, yet they were accurate. The boiling process stripped the flesh and loosened the ligaments so that the bones would have knocked against the iron sides as the water simmered. It was a rhythmic clatter in the dead of night. "Where does she live?" "Next door, number 4. She has a view of the scullery window." Arnold walked to the window. It looked out onto a small yard, enclosed by a high brick wall. The ground was muddy, trodden down by recent feet. He could see the shed where the coal was kept. The door hung slightly ajar. "Did you check the coal?" Arnold asked. "Coal, sir." The shed, outside. Arnold turned from the window, and as the light from the yard caught the side of his face, it highlighted the deep lines around his mouth. To boil a body down to the bone, you need heat. Sustained heat. Wood won't do it. You need coal, a lot of it. Miller frowned. "I haven't been outside yet," focused on the interior. "Go." Arnold moved towards the door, his shoulder brushing past the constable. "Count the sacks. If she bought enough coal to heat water for a week's washing, there will be a gap. If she bought enough to boil a woman, there will be receipts." "And then?" "And then I speak to Mrs. Dyer." Arnold stepped back into the hallway. The air here was cooler, less tainted by the soap. He adjusted his collar, feeling the stiffness of the starch against his neck. "She heard the noise. She knows the hours. If I can match the boiling times to the tide charts, I can place the parcels on the mudflats with precision." "Precision," Miller said. He seemed to be testing the word. "Will that bring her back?" Arnold stopped. He looked at the staircase leading to the upper floor. The carpet was worn on the treads, showing the wood beneath. Someone had walked up and down those steps many times. Webster, Thomas, the victim and the killer sharing the same space, breathing the same air, until the air ran out. "It won't bring her back," Arnold said. His voice dropped, losing its procedural edge, becoming something quieter, more human. "But it will stop the lie. Webster is out there telling people she is Mrs. Thomas. She is wearing her clothes, spending her money. We need to prove that Mrs. Thomas is in the ground, or in the river, or in a jar on my desk." He started up the stairs. The wood groaned under his weight. "Sir, I thought we were checking the coal." "We are." Arnold didn't look back. He needed to see the bedroom. The skeleton of the chapter said he would find the drawer forced open. He needed to see the erasure with his own eyes before he talked to the neighbor. "You check the shed. I will check the room where she slept. Meet me at the front door in 10 minutes. Bring the neighbor if she is willing. And if she isn't? Arnold reached the landing. The shadows were longer here, the light from the downstairs window failing to penetrate the gloom. He turned his head slightly, just enough for Miller to see the profile of his jaw. Tell her I have a leg in a jar at the station, Arnold said, adding that he needed to know whose it was, because that usually opens doors. He walked away before Miller could respond. The floorboards creaked, a lonely sound in the empty house. He moved towards the master bedroom, drawn by the certainty that the violence hadn't stopped in the kitchen. It had followed them up the stairs. It had ended in the bed. And somewhere in this room, amidst the pretty things and the polite furniture, was the reason why a maid would boil her mistress down to soap and bone. He pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, trapped. A heavy gold watch sat on the bedside table, ticking loudly in the silence. Arnold ignored it. Thieves took gold. Murderers took identities. He scanned the room for the drawer that didn't fit, the space that was empty, the sign that a woman had been wiped from the earth as thoroughly as the grease from the kitchen floor. The hook was set. Now he just needed to find the bait. The latch clicked. Arnold pushed. Wood scraped against the frame, a dry, complaining sound that seemed too loud for a house holding its breath. He stepped across the threshold, boots sinking into a carpet that felt spongy, damp with a moisture that hadn't dried since the rain 3 days prior. The room smelled of lavender water, heavy and cloying, layered over something sharper. Sweat, fear, the metallic tang of a life interrupted. Light filtered through the gap in the curtains, a grey, watery shaft that cut the gloom and illuminated dancing dust motes. They spun in the stillness, indifferent to the violation. Arnold let his eyes adjust, scanning the perimeter. A washstand with a chipped basin, water inside turned cloudy with age. A wardrobe, doors shut tight. A dressing table cluttered with bottles of scent, brushes with bristles matted in hair, a silver-backed mirror reflecting nothing but the opposite wall. Ordinary, domestic, a stage set for a woman who liked her things arranged just so. He moved to the bed. The linens were rumpled, tangled at the foot as if someone had kicked them in a struggle, then smoothed them out with hasty, impatient hands. A depression remained in the mattress, a ghost of weight. Arnold ran a finger along the bedpost. No dust. Someone had cleaned here too, wiped down the surfaces, scrubbed the visible stains, but missed the corners where the grime of panic settles. He turned to the chest of drawers. Mahogany, polished to a high sheen that caught the weak light. 3 drawers stood flush against the frame. The middle one gaped open, an inch of darkness revealing the chaos within. Arnold crouched, his knees cracked, a sharp pop in the silence. He pulled the drawer fully open. Clothes torn from their hangers, crumpled into a ball of silk and wool at the bottom. Undergarments, lace torn, scattered like shredded paper, but no jewelry box, no purse, no letters. The space where a woman keeps her history, her savings, her secrets, was empty, scooped out. Yet on the bedside table, gleaming in the dustlight, sat the watch. Gold heavy, the chain draped over the edge, links catching the light. Arnold reached out, hovering his hand over it without touching. A thief taking a life would take the gold. A burglar breaking in would strip the room bare, leaving only the mattress and the floorboards. This was selective, surgical. Webster hadn't taken the watch because it was worthless to her. She had taken the identity. The clothes, the papers, the letters that proved Julia Martha Thomas existed as a person separate from the maid who served her. She was wearing the dead woman's life now, stitching herself into the gaps, hoping the fit would hold. Arnold straightened, his back protesting the movement. He walked to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains down into the yard where Miller would be counting coal sacks. The neighbor's house, number 4, loomed close, its windows dark despite the hour. Mrs. Dyer, the woman who heard the bones rattle. He needed the times, precise hours. If the boiling started at dusk and ended at dawn, it matched the tide that carried the parcels away. If it happened midday, the theory collapsed. Correlation was the only currency he had. Without it, he was just a man standing in a messy room with a gold watch and a bad feeling. A floorboard creaked behind him. Arnold spun, hand going to his pocket where his notebook rested, fingers brushing the leather cover. Miller stood in the doorway, hat in hand, face flushed from the cold air outside. He looked small in the frame, swallowed by the shadows of the hallway. "Coal?" Arnold asked. The word came out sharp, demanding. 17 sacks missing, sir," Miller said. He stepped into the room, eyes darting to the open drawer, then to the watch. He didn't ask about it. He knew better. The delivery boy remembered the order. Large quantity, paid for in cash by the maid. Said she wanted it stacked high before the frost set in. 17 sacks. Arnold did the calculation instantly, enough to keep a fire roaring for days, enough to maintain a rolling boil while the flesh loosened, while the fat rendered, while the meat fell away from the calcium. And the neighbor. "Waiting in the hall. She's shaking, sir. Says she doesn't want to see the jars." "She won't see them." Arnold moved past Miller, heading for the door. "Not yet. I just need her ears." They descended the stairs together, the wood groaning under their combined weight. The air in the hallway felt heavier now, pressed down by the knowledge of what had happened in the room above. The erasure was complete up there. Downstairs, the evidence of the process remained. Mrs. Dyer stood by the front door, clutching a shawl tight around her shoulders. She was a small woman, bird-like, with eyes that darted from Arnold to Miller and back again. Her face was pale, lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. "Inspector," she said, her voice trembled, barely a whisper. "You have it, the leg." "I have evidence, Mrs. Dyer," Arnold said. He kept his tone flat, devoid of the grotesque imagery he'd threatened Miller with. No need to frighten her further. Fear made memories slippery. "I need you to tell me about the noise, the boiling." She flinched at the word. "It started on Tuesday, or was it Wednesday?" She closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples. The night was so quiet, too quiet. Then the sound began like stones in a pot, clinking over and over. "What time?" Arnold stepped closer, invading her space just enough to demand focus. "Did the church bells sound before it started?" "Yes," she nodded, her eyes snapping open. "St. Mary's, 9 o'clock. It started just after, a moment she remembers clearly because she was putting the kettle on for her husband's tea." "And when did it stop?" "Morning, just before dawn." As she shivered and pulled the shawl tighter, she whispered, "I heard the back door open, followed by the scrape of a cart and wheels on the cobbles. Then silence." Arnold pulled his notebook from his pocket, flipping it open to reveal pages filled with his tight, cramped script. Tide charts, times of high water at Barnes and Putney. 9 at night to 5 in the morning. 8 hours. Enough time to strip a body if the fire was hot enough. Enough time to wait for the tide to turn, to slip down to the mudflats under the cover of the fog that rolled off the river like a blanket. "The cart," Arnold said, pen hovering. "Did you see who was driving it?" "No, it was dark, but it sounded heavy, laden down." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. "It was her, wasn't it? The maid. I saw her carrying sacks to the shed earlier that week. Heavy ones. She said it was laundry, who washes enough laundry to fill 17 sacks of coal." Arnold didn't answer. He didn't need to. The question hung in the air, rhetorical and damning. "Thank you, Mrs. Dyer," he said. "You've been very helpful. Constable Miller will see you home." He turned away before she could ask more questions, before she could demand to know what happened to the rest of the woman whose bones had rattled in the night. He walked back towards the kitchen, the scene of the crime, the place where the domestic had curdled into the monstrous. Miller followed, ushering the neighbor out the front door with a gentle hand on her elbow. The latch clicked shut, sealing the house once more. Arnold stood in the center of the kitchen. The copper boiler sat cold and dark in the corner, its surface dull. The floor was scrubbed white, but the cracks in the tiles held the truth. He walked to the scullery, the small room off the kitchen where the rubbish was kept. A bin sat in the corner, overflowing with ash and scraps. He picked up a pair of tongs from the hearth and began to sift through the refuse. Ash coated his boots. The smell of stale smoke rose up, choking. There, buried beneath a layer of cabbage leaves and eggshells, a piece of paper, stiff, coated in soot. He picked it up with the tongs, holding it to the light. A receipt from the coal merchant on the high street, dated 4 days before the disappearance. 20 sacks, best anthracite. 20 sacks, not 17. 3 had already been burned by the time the neighbor heard the clinking start. 3 sacks just to get the fire hot enough to begin the work. Arnold folded the paper, tucking it into his notebook beside the tide charts, and as the pieces locked together, they formed a picture too terrible to look at directly. The watch on the bedside table, the missing clothes, the coal, and the times. Webster thought she had cleaned it all away. She thought she had boiled the evidence down to nothing, scattered the rest in the river, and walked away wearing another woman's skin. She hadn't counted on the coal. She hadn't counted on the neighbor's insomnia. She hadn't counted on a man who needed the silence to stop. Arnold closed the notebook. The leather cover snapped shut, a final, decisive sound. "Miller," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty house. "Bring the cab around. We're going to the station." "And then, sir," Miller's footsteps approached from the hallway. "And then," Arnold said, looking at the cold copper boiler, "we send a telegram to Ireland." He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. The receipt in his pocket burned like a coal against his side, a hot, hard certainty that the maid was running and the noose was already tightening around her neck. The river kept its secrets, but the paper trail did not. He walked out into the grey afternoon, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving the quiet villa to its ghosts. The pawnbroker's shop smelled of damp wool and desperation, a cloying thickness that stuck to the back of Arnold's throat like old fat. "Silver plate," the man said, tapping the glass counter with a yellowed fingernail. 6 teaspoons, good weight. She wanted cash, not a ticket. Arnold leaned forward, his breath fogging the pane between them. Behind the glass, the spoons lay in a velvet-lined tray, their handles tarnished, but the engraving still sharp enough to catch the gaslight. JMT, the initials sat there, small and accusing, etched into the metal long before the flesh had been stripped from the bone. "Describe her," Arnold said. His voice came out low, flattened by the exhaustion of 3 sleepless nights. Tall, broad in the shoulder, Irish by the sound of her, she kept looking at the door, jumpy as a cat in a dog kennel. The pawnbroker shrugged, a movement that rippled through his heavy waistcoat. Said she was selling off family heirlooms to pay a debt. Didn't ask which debt. Never do. He reached under the counter, producing a small, crumpled slip of paper. The pawn ticket, number 4892, dated yesterday afternoon. She left this, saying she might return for them if luck turned. The man laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "They don't come back, Inspector, not the ones who sell the silver." Arnold took the ticket. The paper felt greasy, stained by the pawnbroker's thumb and the damp air of the shop. He folded it once, twice, until it was a small, hard square in his palm. Proof, not of the murderer that was written in the coal ash and the river Muda, but of the flight. Webster had turned the dead woman's possessions into train fare, converting a life into shillings before the body was even cold in the water. "How much did you give her?" 10 shillings, maybe 8 if I'm honest. Silver's down, and she was in a hurry." The pawnbroker wiped his hands on his apron, leaving streaks of grey dust on the fabric. "She went straight to the station after, asked the way to Waterloo." Arnold nodded. He didn't thank the man. Gratitude felt like a luxury reserved for cases where the ending wasn't already written in blood. He turned and pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling with a cheerful indifference that grated against his nerves. Outside, the pavement was slick with a fine, oily rain that made the cobblestones shine like black teeth. A hansom cab waited at the curb, the horse stamping impatiently, its breath rising in white plumes that vanished into the gloom. Miller stood beside it, smoking a cigarette, the ember glowing bright orange in the dimness. "Waterloo," Arnold said, climbing in. The leather seat was cold, seeping through his trousers to chill his bones. "And step on it." The wheels clattered over the stones, the rhythm irregular, jarring Arnold's elbow against the window frame with every bump. He watched the city blur past to the grey facades of the terraced houses, the hunched figures hurrying under umbrellas, the endless procession of carts and drays clogging the arteries of London. Everyone going somewhere, everyone with a destination, except the woman in the river whose journey had ended in a pot of boiling water and a sack dropped on the mudflats. He closed his eyes, trying to reconstruct her, not the monster the papers would paint tomorrow, but the woman who had walked out of that house with a trunk on her back and a head full of panic. She would have checked her pockets every 10 steps. She would have flinched at every shout, every police whistle. 10 shillings wouldn't get her far, not to Ireland, not with a trunk. She needed more. The cab slowed as they approached the station, the traffic thickening into a gridlock of wheels and hooves. Arnold jumped out before it fully stopped, his boots hitting the wet pavement with a splash. He didn't wait for Miller. He pushed through the crowd in the concourse, the air thick with coal smoke and the shouting of porters. "Tickets to Ireland," he barked at the first clerk he saw, a young man with ink-stained cuffs and a face pale from the indoor air. The clerk blinked, startled. "Sir." Yesterday afternoon, a woman was buying a ticket to Wexford or Dublin. Arnold slammed his hand on the counter, the sound cracking like a pistol shot. "Think." The clerk flinched before scrambling for the ledger, and as pages turned, they rustled like dry leaves. "There was one," he said, "to Dublin, a connecting packet for Wexford bought by Mrs. Jones. Description: dark hair, heavy build, carrying a large trunk, black leather bound with iron." The clerk looked up, his eyes wide. "She argued about the excess baggage fee, said the trunk was light, but it took 2 men to lift it onto the cart." Arnold felt a cold clarity settle over him, sharp and clean as a knife, noting a trunk light enough to carry yet heavy enough to require 2 men. The math didn't work unless the trunk was empty or filled with something less dense than the life it had replaced, though perhaps she had packed her clothes on top of the rest of it, the weight distributed to hide the truth. It didn't matter. The destination was the thing. Wexford, Killan, the uncle's farm where the accent would blend in and the questions would be fewer. "Did she board?" "Train left at 4:40, packet sails tonight from Holyhead." The clerk tapped the page. "She's on the water, sir, if she made the connection." Arnold stepped back from the counter. The noise of the station rushed back in the whistle of the engine, the cry of the newsboys, the shuffling of 1,000 feet. He pulled the pawn ticket from his pocket, looking at the number again. 4892, a sequence, a trail. "Miller," he said, turning as his constable pushed through the crowd. "Telegraph office, now." "So, we need to speak to Dublin and Holyhead." Arnold started walking, his stride long and purposeful, cutting through the throng. "Tell them to hold the packet. Tell them there's a woman on board with a trunk that doesn't belong to her." "And if she's already gone?" Miller asked, trotting to keep up. Arnold didn't slow down. He pushed open the door to the telegraph office, the smell of ozone and hot machinery hitting him like a physical blow. "Then we tell Wexford to meet her at the pier. She thinks she's going home. She thinks the river has swallowed her sins." He took the pen from the clerk's hand, the metal cool against his skin. He began to write, the scratch of the nib loud in the sudden quiet of his own mind. Subject: Kate Webster, an Irish female of approximately 30 years with dark hair, traveling with a heavy black trunk. Last seen in Richmond, she is bound for Wexford via Holyhead. Suspected of murder, she must be detained upon arrival without alerting her, and you are to await further instructions. He blew on the ink, watching it dry, the letters forming a net that was already tightening across the Irish Sea. The river had kept the head, but the paper trail would catch the hands. "Send it," Arnold said, handing the slip over, "fast as the wire will carry." As the clerk tapped out the message, the rhythmic clicking sounding like a countdown, Arnold turned to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the glass streaked with grime. Somewhere out there, in the grey churn of the channel, a packet boat cut through the waves. And inside it, a woman sat with a trunk she couldn't open, waiting for a shore that wouldn't welcome her. The click-clack of the telegraph keys stopped. The clerk looked up. "Reply already coming through, Inspector, from Dublin." Arnold froze. It was too soon. The wire shouldn't have reached Ireland and back in less than an hour unless the message had been waiting, unless someone else had been watching the ports. The clerk read the slip as it printed, his brow furrowing. "Sir, they say a woman matching the description disembarked at Wexford an hour ago, alone, but the trunk." "What about the trunk?" Arnold's voice dropped, a low growl that made the clerk shrink back. "It wasn't with her, sir. She left it on the boat, saying she'd send for it." The clerk looked up, confusion warring with fear in his eyes. "But the crew checked it when she left, and they said it was locked, yet it was bleeding." The engine groaned, a deep metallic shudder that traveled up through the soles of Arnold's boots and settled in his knees. Salt spray hissed against the porthole, stinging the glass with microscopic dots of brine that blurred the black swell outside. He sat at a scarred wooden table bolted to the floor, the notebook open before him, pages fluttering despite the weight of his hand pressing them flat. Dampness curled the edges of the paper, softening the crispness of the warrant he had drafted in the dry heat of the London office. Now the ink seemed to swim, the letters bleeding into the fibre just as the trunk had reportedly bled into the hold of the vessel ahead. Miller stood by the bulkhead, smoking a cigarette he had no permission to light. The smoke hung low, mixing with the coal dust that coated every surface in the cabin. "You should put that out," Arnold said. He didn't look up from the page. "The steward won't care. We're the only souls in first class." Miller flicked ash onto the floorboards. "Besides, it cuts the smell of the bilge." "It cuts nothing, it masks." Arnold traced the line where he had written Kate Webster. The pen had dug deep into the paper there, a groove remaining even where the ink had dried. "She left the trunk. Why?" "Too heavy to carry once she cleared customs." Miller shrugged, the movement stiff in the cramped space. "Or she knew we'd be looking for a woman lugging a coffin-sized box across the Irish countryside." "A trunk that bleeds is not merely heavy, Miller. It is evidence that refuses to stay buried." Arnold closed the notebook. The cover was cold, clammy with the sea air. "If the wood is weeping, then the seal is broken. Fat renders, blood coagulates, but heat keeps things fluid." He stood, the motion rocking him slightly as the boat dipped into a trough. The horizon outside was a jagged line of grey water meeting a darker grey sky. No sun, no stars, only the indifferent churn of the channel. He had crossed this water before, years ago, on a different hunt that had ended in a quiet room and a confession written in a shaky hand. This felt different. The air here was thicker, laden with peat smoke from the distant coast and the raw, fishy scent of the Atlantic tide pulling against the river outflow. "The Dublin Telegraph said the crew checked it," Arnold said, noting that while it was locked and iron-bound, it was also wet. "Wood swells in water, Inspector. Maybe the seams opened." "Not seawater. Blood has a different viscosity. It sticks." Arnold walked to the porthole, wiping a circle on the glass with his handkerchief. The fabric came away grey. "She boiled her mistress, rendered the flesh from the bone in a copper pot on a kitchen range. Then she packed what remained into leather and iron. She thinks the sea will wash it clean." "And you think it won't?" "I know it won't." Arnold turned from the window. His face was pale, the watery blue eyes narrowed against the dim light of the cabin lamp. "The river keeps what is given to it. The sea gives nothing back unless it chooses to, but a trunk in a hold, that is a man-made thing. It follows man-made rules." A bell clanged overhead, sharp and urgent. The engine note changed, the rhythm slowing, the pitch dropping as the propellers churned harder against the shallowing water. "Approaching Wexford," Miller said, crushing the cigarette under his heel. "You ready for the welcome?" "There will be no welcome." As Arnold picked up his hat, brushing the damp from the brim, he declared, "We are English police on Irish soil. To them, we are invaders, yet to her, we remain the only thing standing between freedom and the gallows." "She has family here." "Uncle a farmer in Killan." Arnold adjusted his left glove, pulling the leather tight over the wrist. The ritual calmed the tremor in his fingers, the one he refused to acknowledge. "She will go to ground. She expects loyalty. Blood ties are stronger than warrants in places like this. Then we arrest her before she reaches the farmhouse. If she is already there, we wait." Arnold moved towards the door, stepping over the puddle of seawater that had tracked in from the deck. "But first, I need to see the trunk." "The trunk is on the other boat, sir, the one she disembarked from." "No," Arnold stopped, his hand on the latch. "The Telegraph said she left it on the boat. It did not say which boat. If she transferred luggage to confuse the line, the trunk might be on this vessel. stored away while she took the train. Miller frowned, pushing off the bulkhead. You think she played the line, checked one bag through and kept the other? I think she is desperate, and a desperate woman makes mistakes. Arnold opened the door. The wind hit them immediately, a cold fist against the chest, carrying the scream of gulls and the shout of dockworkers. Check the manifest, find out if there is unclaimed cargo in the hold. And if there isn't, then we go ashore and ask the uncle why his niece travels light. Arnold stepped out onto the deck. The rain had started again, fine and misting, settling on his coat like a second skin. The dock loomed ahead, a jagged mouth of timber and stones swallowing the boat. Men were already moving on the quay, shadows in the gloom, waiting to tie up the lines. Arnold gripped the rail, his knuckles white against the wet iron. He scanned the crowd on the pier. Most were dockhands, caps pulled low, trousers rolled against the spray. A few passengers waited to board, huddled in shawls and greatcoats. None looked like Webster. She would not wait. She would have moved the moment her feet touched the planks. Inspector, Miller shouted over the wind, leaning out of the cabin door. There is a crate. Manifest says personal effects. Consignee blank. Where's? Forward hold. They're unloading it now. Arnold turned. Near the bow, a crane was swinging a dark shape out of the hatch. It was not a crate. It was a trunk. Black leather, bound with iron straps, scarred from the journey. It swung in the air, dripping water onto the deck below. The wood looked swollen, dark patches staining the surface where the rain hit it. Careful, Arnold yelled, though the men below could not hear him over the engine. The trunk landed on the quay with a heavy, wet thud. No one moved to touch it immediately. The dockhands stepped back, looking at the stains spreading on the planks beneath the lock. It was not just water. It was dark, viscous, running in a thin line towards the gutter. Arnold vaulted the rail, ignoring the protocol of the gangplank. He hit the deck running, his boots slipping on the wet wood. Miller was behind him, shouting something about the warrant, but the words were lost in the cry of the gulls. The trunk sat alone on the pier. The lock was intact. The bleeding had stopped, but the smell was rising now, cutting through the salt and the coal. It was sweet, cloying, the smell of a butcher's shop left open in the sun. Arnold stopped 3 feet from the leather. He did not touch it. He looked at the wood, at the way the grain had swollen, at the dark seepage around the keyhole. Get the constable on the pier, Arnold said, his voice flat and devoid of the tremor shaking his hands. And find me a crowbar. Sir, we need a magistrate for this, if we break it open without her. She left it, Arnold said, labeling it abandoned property and evidence of a capital crime. His eyes hardened as he looked at Miller. Do you want to explain to the Home Secretary why we let a trunk full of women rot in an Irish harbor because we waited for a signature? Miller hesitated, then nodded, turning to signal the local police. Arnold knelt. He brought his face close to the leather, inhaling the scent. It was not just blood, it was fat, rendered down, cooled, then warmed again by the hold's heat. Hello, Kate, he whispered. The dockhand approached with the crowbar, his face pale. He handed it to Arnold without meeting his eyes. Stand back, Arnold said. He wedged the iron into the lid. The wood groaned, resisting. He pushed. The lock snapped with a sharp crack that echoed across the water. The lid lifted an inch. The smell surged out, thick and greasy, coating the back of his throat. Arnold did not flinch. He hooked his fingers under the lid and pulled. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay parcels of white matter floating in a dark slurry. No head, no face, just the remnants of a life reduced to cargo. Bag it, Arnold said, standing up and wiping his hands on his trousers. Every scrap. And the woman? Miller asked, looking from the trunk to the road leading away from the pier. Arnold followed his gaze. The road wound inland, towards the hills where the fog was gathering. A single figure in a black shawl was hurrying down the lane, moving fast, head down against the wind. The gait was heavy, purposeful. The stride of a woman who knew the law was behind her but thought she had outrun it. There, Arnold said, pointing, noting that she hadn't gone to the farm yet because she was watching. Miller squinted. That's her. That's the walk, Arnold tucked the crowbar under his arm, then added, "Leave the trunk. Let the locals stare, we take the woman." He started towards the road, his boots crunching on the gravel. The fog was rolling in off the hills, thick and yellow, swallowing the figure ahead. "Keep her in sight," Arnold called back, "but do not spook her, not until we have the ground." The figure turned a corner, disappearing into the mist. Arnold quickened his pace. The hunt had moved from the water to the land, and the terrain was about to become much more difficult. Gravel shifted under the sole of Arnold's boot, loose stones skittering into the ditch. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to let them stray from the patch of black shawl dissolving into the yellow swirl, and pushed forward, lungs burning with the damp air. Miller trailed close, breath hitching in a rhythm that matched the inspector's own stride, though the younger man's coat flapped louder against his thighs. "Road curves left," Miller gasped. "Keep the wall." Arnold brushed the rough stone boundary with his left hand, the grit scraping his palm. It grounded him. The pier was gone now, swallowed by the mist, along with the stench of the trunk that clung to his cuffs like a second skin. Here the air tasted different, peat smoke, wet dog, something sour fermenting in the hedgerows, not the coal dust choke of London, nor the brine-heavy rot of the Thames mudflats. This was older, stagnant. The land itself seemed to resist their passage, the hedges thick with thorns that caught at wool and skin alike. They rounded the bend. The figure remained visible, a smudge of darkness against the grey, moving with an urgency that spoke of fear rather than purpose. Webster did not walk like a woman returning home. She walked like a rat fleeing a flood. "Shall I call out?" Miller asked, hand drifting towards the truncheon at his belt. "No," Arnold kept his voice low, barely audible over the wind sighing through the rushes. "She knows the law is behind her. Let her think she has the lead. Why, if we run, we take her now. And have her claim coercion on foreign soil, or bolt into a bog where we lose her forever." Arnold paused to adjust his damp, heavy cuff, a gesture required to steady the tremor in his fingers. The grease from the trunk felt ingrained, a phantom layer of fat that no amount of scrubbing would shift, smelling of rendered human suet mixed with turf smoke whenever the wind died down. "We follow, we watch, we take her when she believes she is safe." Miller nodded, though the tension in his jaw suggested he favored a quicker resolution. They moved on. The road narrowed, the gravel giving way to packed earth that sucked at their heels. Rain began to fall, not the hard drive of the London winter, but a fine, persistent drizzle that settled on the eyelashes and blurred the vision. Arnold blinked it away. He had calculated the times on the boat. Webster had landed 20 minutes prior. She had no carriage waiting, no accomplice flagged down on the quay. Just her own 2 feet, and the knowledge of where her uncle lived. Killan, the name sat in Arnold's mind like a stone. The landscape opened up slightly, the hedgerows retreating to reveal fields of scrub grass, dotted with grey stones that looked too much like bones in the gloom. Arnold found his gaze dropping to them, counting, categorizing, before forcing his attention back to the road. He was looking for a head that did not exist, a skull lost to the river or the fire or the deep, silent earth. Here, in this quiet place, the absence felt louder. "Inspector," Miller pointed. Ahead the road forked. The figure hesitated at the junction, a moment of stillness in the constant motion. She turned her head, just slightly, scanning the mist behind them. Arnold pulled Miller back into the shadow of a large ash tree, the bark rough against his shoulder. They waited. The figure did not see them. She chose the left path, the one winding uphill towards a cluster of dark shapes that could only be buildings. "Farmhouse," Miller whispered. "Uncle's property," Arnold corrected. "She's going to ground." "What's the play? Surround it." "There is no us to surround, just you and me, and God knows how many of her kin inside." As Arnold stepped out from the tree, the decision settled over him like a weight. He felt the familiar ache in his lower back, the toll of the journey from Richmond, the train, the boat, the chase. He wanted to sit. He wanted a cup of tea that wasn't stewed in a ship's galley, and he wanted the ledger closed. We approach civilly. We ask for the woman. If they hand her over, good. If they lie. If they lie. Then we wait. Arnold started walking again, slower now. The urgency had evaporated, replaced by the cold patience of the trap. She cannot stay in there forever, and she knows it. The hill climbed steadily. The farmhouse emerged from the fog as they crested the rise, a low, whitewashed structure with a thatched roof sagging under the weight of the rain. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and blue, disappearing into the cloud base. No lights burned in the windows yet. It was too early for evening, but the gloom made it feel like twilight. Arnold counted the windows, 2 on the ground floor, 1 door, a shed to the rear. He stopped 50 yards from the gate. The figure had vanished inside. "Miller," Arnold said, his voice barely disturbing the air, before commanding him to stay right there by the gate. "If anything moves from the back, you tackle it. Do not shoot. I want her breathing for the Old Bailey." "And you?" "I'll knock." Arnold walked alone up the path where the mud, deep and clinging to his boots with a suction that sounded like a kiss, slowed his stride. He could hear the sea again, distant now, roaring against the cliffs somewhere beyond the hills. It sounded like the Thames, yet wilder and uncontained. Stopping at the door, he faced wood that was dark and swollen with moisture. He raised his hand and rapped 3 times, the sound dull and absorbed by the thick walls. No answer. He waited. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of burning turf from the chimney. It smelled warm, domestic, a stark contrast to the cold parcels in the trunk back on the pier. He thought of Julia Martha Thomas, not the bones, not the flesh, but the woman who had sat in a room like this, perhaps, before the maid turned on her, before the boiling started. He knocked again, harder. Inside, a footstep, heavy, deliberate. Arnold straightened his coat, smoothing the lapels over the stain he knew was there, then tugged the worn leather of his left hand until the seam aligned with his pulse, a familiar friction against his skin. It was a ritual, a shield. When the door latch clicked, the wood groaned inward. A man stood in the doorway, older, face lined like a dried apple, eyes sharp and wary. He did not speak. He looked at Arnold, then at the badge pinned to the coat, then back to Arnold's face. "Inspector Arnold," Arnold said. His voice was flat, devoid of the tremor in his hands. "Metropolitan Police, London." The man said nothing. He just stared, his hand resting on the edge of the door, knuckles white. Behind him, the darkness of the house yawned, warm and smelling of food and secrets. Arnold could feel the eyes of the household on him from the shadows within. He did not step forward. He did not blink. "I'm here for Kate Webster," Arnold said. The man's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped near the ear. He glanced over Arnold's shoulder towards the gate where Miller stood hidden in the mist. "She's not here," the man said. His accent was thick, the vowels round and rolling. Arnold looked past him, into the hallway, where a wet shawl hung on a peg by the fire, dripping while still steaming. "Open the door," Arnold said, "all the way." The man hesitated. The fire crackled behind him, spitting a spark onto the hearthstone. Outside, the wind moaned around the eaves, sounding for all the world like a woman crying in the next room. Arnold waited. He had all the time in the world. The boat wasn't leaving until morning, and the trunk on the pier was waiting to be weighed. "Open it," Arnold repeated. The man sighed, a sound of defeat that ruffled the hair on his chin. He stepped back. The door swung wide. Arnold crossed the threshold. The warmth hit him first, then the smell, not just turf, boiling fat. It hung in the air, faint but undeniable, mingling with the scent of cabbage and damp wool. He stopped in the center of the room. The floor was scrubbed clean, but the grout lines were dark. "Where is she?" Arnold asked. The man pointed to a closed door at the rear of the kitchen. "Bedroom," the man said, "sleeping." "Is she?" "She says she is." Arnold walked to the door. He placed his hand on the latch. It was cold. He looked at the uncle, then at the closed wood. He could hear breathing on the other side, shallow, fast. "Tell her to come out," Arnold said, "or I come in." Silence stretched between them, tight as a wire. Outside, the wind dropped. The only sound was the fire and the breathing behind the door. Arnold waited. He did not move. He did not blink. He let the silence do the work. The latch on the bedroom door clicked. The latch clicked, a sharp metallic bite that severed the wind's low moan. Arnold stood on the threshold, the damp wool of his greatcoat heavy on his shoulders, smelling of river mud and coal smoke that had traveled with him across the Irish Sea. Patrick Webster filled the doorway, a block of flesh and stubborn silence. his boots planted wide on the flagstone as if rooting himself against the tide. He did not step aside. He did not speak. He simply existed as a wall, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Arnold's left shoulder, refusing to acknowledge the authority of the London man in his own kitchen. "Move," Arnold said. His voice was low, stripped of the London cadence that usually flattened his vowels into something indistinct. Here, in this green and wet sanctuary, the words felt foreign, dangerous. "She's not here," Patrick said. The words came out flat, rehearsed, lacking the tremor of a lie told for the first time. "My niece is a housekeeper. She's on business, traveling." "Business?" Arnold repeated. He stepped forward, forcing Patrick to recoil or be struck. The uncle flinched, shifting his weight, and that small movement opened the gap just enough. Arnold pushed past him, the rough fabric of his coat brushing against Patrick's arm, bringing the scent of stale tobacco and unwashed wool into the room with him. The kitchen was warm, too warm, the air thick with the smell of burning turf and something else, something cloying and greasy that clung to the back of the throat. It reminded Arnold of the foreshore at low tide, of the rendered fat that had coated the bones in the parcels. He scanned the room, his watery blue eyes narrowing against the smoke. Kate Webster sat by the fire, her back to the wall, her hands resting on the lid of a black leather trunk. She looked pale, the skin beneath her eyes bruised and shadowed, but her posture was rigid, defiant. She did not rise. She did not greet him. She watched him with the stillness of a cornered animal waiting to see if the trapdoor would open. "Mrs. Thomas," Arnold said. He let the name hang in the air, testing its weight. Kate's fingers tightened on the leather handle. The knuckles turned white, then pink, then white again. "She's gone," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as they traced the edge of the trunk. "To the continent. I told you. I told the others." "The others?" Arnold took a step closer. The floorboards creaked under his weight, a dry protest against the intrusion. "There are no others, Miss Webster. There is only me and the paper in my pocket." He reached inside his coat, his movements slow, deliberate, giving her time to watch, time to understand what was coming. He pulled out the pawn ticket, the small slip of paper yellowed and creased. He held it up, letting the firelight catch the ink. "Number 482. Dated the 3rd of March. Pledged by a woman matching your description. Items matching the wardrobe of the missing Richmond landlady." Kate stared at the paper. Her breath hitched, a small, ragged sound that seemed too loud in the sudden stillness of the room. "That proves nothing," she said, though the conviction in her voice was crumbling, eroding like the banks of the Thames under the relentless tide. "Anyone could pawn clothes. She gave them to me for safekeeping." "Safekeeping," Arnold said. He folded the ticket carefully, placing it back in his pocket with a ritualistic precision that made Kate flinch. "And the body? Did she give you that for safekeeping too? The leg found in Barnes, the torso wrapped in oilcloth, the pieces boiling in a pot while you sat here, pretending to be a dutiful niece." Patrick made a noise, a guttural sound of protest, and took a half step towards Arnold. "You have no right to." "I have every right," Arnold snapped, turning on him. The sudden aggression startled the uncle, stopping him in his tracks. "I have a warrant, I have evidence, and I have a witness who saw you carrying that trunk to the station in Richmond." He turned back to Kate. "Where is she, Kate? Where is the rest of her?" Kate's eyes darted to the trunk, then to the fire, then back to Arnold. The defiance was cracking, fissures appearing in the mask she had worn for weeks. She left," she whispered. "She just left." "She didn't leave," Arnold said. He walked to the table, placing his hands on the rough wood, leaning in until he could see the pores in her skin, the faint tremor in her lower lip. "She is dead. You killed her. You cut her up. You boiled her flesh until it separated from the bone, and then you threw her into the river like rubbish." "No," Kate screamed. The word tore from her throat, raw and jagged. She surged to her feet, knocking the chair backward. It hit the floor with a crash that echoed in the small room. "It wasn't like that. She fell, she slipped." "Slipped," Arnold repeated, unmoving and unblinking as he simply watched her, letting the words settle into the silence. "Slipped into what? Into the knife, into the pot." "The head," Kate gasped, her hands shaking now with violent spasms she couldn't control. She clutched at her apron, twisting the fabric as she insisted the head was an accident. I didn't mean for the head to come off, it slipped. The room went still. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath, the flames freezing in their dance. Arnold felt a cold certainty settle in his gut, heavier than the mud on his boots. The skull, the missing piece, the one thing that had haunted his ledger, the gap that had refused to be filled. She had just handed it to him, wrapped in a confession that no jury could ignore. Patrick slumped against the doorframe, his face grey, his eyes wide with a horror that went beyond fear. He knew what she had said. He knew what it meant. He looked at Arnold, a silent plea in his eyes, but Arnold ignored him. He kept his gaze locked on Kate. "Say it again," Arnold said softly, "for the constable." He gestured to the door. The local man stepped inside, his face grim, the handcuffs dangling from his hand like a pair of steel snakes. Kate saw them. She saw the inevitability of it. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no sound came out. The fight had gone out of her, drained away by the simple, terrible truth of her own words. "I didn't mean it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for the head to slip." Arnold nodded. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel joy. He only felt the weary relief of a job done, of a ledger entry completed, even if the skull itself remained lost in the silt of the Thames. He stepped aside, making room for the constable. "Take her," he said. The steel clicked shut around her wrists. Kate didn't scream this time. She just stood there, staring at the fire, watching the flames consume the turf, turning it to ash. Arnold turned away, pushing open the front door. The cold air hit him, sharp and clean, washing the smell of grease and fear from his lungs. He walked out into the night, towards the waiting carriage, towards the long journey back to London. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the sea, and for the first time in weeks, he breathed easy. The trap was shut. The bones would speak, and the river, finally, could keep its secrets. The hull groaned, a deep wooden complaint that vibrated through the soles of Arnold's boots and settled in the marrow of his shins. Outside the cabin door, the Irish Sea slapped against the iron plating, rhythmic and indifferent, while inside, the air hung thick with the stench of unwashed wool and the sour tang of fear. Kate Webster sat on the narrow berth, her knees drawn up to her chest, rocking slightly with the motion of the packet boat. She had not spoken since the constable in Wexford had clapped the irons on her wrists, nor during the carriage ride to the quay, nor when they had shoved her down the gangplank into the hold. Her silence was not the quiet of contemplation, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a creature playing dead in the hopes the predator might lose interest. Arnold stood in the corridor, his back against the bulkhead, listening. At first there was only the creak of the ship and the distant shout of a sailor on the upper deck, but then, faintly, a sound leaked through the varnished wood. A whimper, low, animal, and wet. It shifted, modulating into a mutter, a stream of words too quiet to decipher but distinct in their cadence. Prayers, or perhaps a recitation of the lies she had told in Killan, rehearsing them for the judge who would soon hold her life in his hands. Arnold pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket, the surface already wrinkled from the sea air, and balanced it on his knee. He uncapped his fountain pen, the nib gleaming dull in the lamplight, and began to write. The scratch of the steel against the fiber was loud in the narrow corridor, a brittle counterpoint to the muffled weeping from the cabin. Subject, recovery of remains. Status, partial. He paused, the ink pooling at the tip of the nib, threatening to drop and stain the page. How to phrase it? How to admit to the superior who demanded certainty that the most crucial piece of the puzzle was gone, vanished into the ether of the Thames? The cranium remains unrecovered, he wrote, the letters tight and controlled. Despite exhaustive dredging of the specified coordinates, no trace of the head has been located. The words looked insufficient on the page, dry and bureaucratic against the horror of a missing face. He knew what the defense would do. It would seize upon that absence, twist it into a shadow of doubt, suggest that perhaps Julia Martha Thomas was not dead at all, but merely walking the streets of London without her head. It was absurd, yet in the courtrooms of the Old Bailey, absurdity often found a foothold. He added another line, his hand moving faster now. Prisoner has confessed to the disposal of the head, citing accidental severance during the initial struggle. Veracity of this claim cannot be independently verified. He stopped, blowing on the wet ink to dry it, watching the sheen fade into matte black. The admission felt like a failure, a crack in the armor of the case he had built with such meticulous care. Without the skull, There could be no positive identification beyond the circumstantial, no proof of the fatal blow. Justice would have to be served on the testimony of a leg, a torso, and a handful of boiled ribs. It would have to be enough. It had to be. The ship's engines slowed, the vibration in the floorboards diminishing to a gentle thrum as they approached the Thames estuary. The change in rhythm roused him from his thoughts. He capped the pen and tucked the letter back into his pocket, next to the pawnbroker's ticket he had taken from the uncle's house in Wexford. A small piece of paper, numbered and dated, proving that Kate Webster had tried to sell the life of her mistress for a few shillings. He stood up, his joints popping in the damp air, and smoothed the front of his coat. Through the porthole, the grey smear of the London skyline began to emerge from the fog, a jagged silhouette of chimneys and spires that promised neither welcome nor rest. The gangplank would be waiting. The reporters would be there, a pack of hounds scenting blood, their notebooks ready, their questions sharp and invasive. They would want a monster. They wanted a story of pure evil, a woman who boiled her mistress for profit and sport. They did not want the trembling figure he had left in the cabin, the one who whispered prayers to a god she had thoroughly offended. Arnold opened the cabin door. The smell of sickness rolled out, mixed with the salt spray. Kate looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, her face pale as the bones in the box at his feet. She did not speak. She just watched him, waiting for the next movement in this terrible dance. He stepped aside, gesturing for the constable to enter. "Time to go," he said, his voice flat, stripped of any emotion that might betray the weariness dragging at his bones. As they led her out, shackled and stumbling, Arnold followed close behind, shielding her from the view of the sailors on deck. He caught her arm when she faltered on the steep stairs, his grip firm but not unkind. For a second their eyes met, and he saw not the killer, but a broken thing, terrified of the crowd waiting on the pier. The fog thickened as they reached the top, swallowing the masts of the ships around them, and somewhere in the distance, the first shouts of the press began to rise, a roar of voices hungry for a name to put to the bones. Arnold tightened his grip on his hat, bracing himself for the surge, knowing that the real trial had not yet begun. The shout came first, a ragged tear in the grey wool of the fog. Then the shoving, men in bowler hats, collars turned up against the damp, pressed against the railing, their boots scraping the wet deck as they jostled for a view of the gangplank. Shouts of Webster and murderess bounced off the iron hull, sharp and eager, lacking the weight of true grief, carrying instead the bright, hungry energy of a holiday crowd dennied its spectacle. Arnold kept his body between them and the woman, a living shield of rough wool and starched linen. He felt the heat of their breath before he saw their faces, a wall of exhalation smelling of tobacco and stale beer that hit him as soon as the plank touched the pier. "Make way," a constable barked, swinging a truncheon that caught the rim of a reporter's hat, knocking it into the mud. The man cursed, scrambling to retrieve it, inkwell sloshing in his pocket. Arnold did not look down. His hand remained clamped on Webster's upper arm, the bone beneath the sleeve feeling fragile, bird-like. She stumbled again, her foot catching on the gap between the ship and the dock, a slick treachery of black water and rusted iron. He yanked her upright, the motion jerking her shoulder, and she made a small, choked sound, half sob, half gasp. "Walk," he said, "not unkind, just necessary." "I can't," she whispered. Her voice was a ruin, scraped raw by salt air and silence. "They'll kill me, before the rope. They'll tear me apart." "They won't. You don't know them." "I know the law." It was a lie, or at least a half-truth dressed in official uniform. The law was a slow machine, grinding miles away in the stone belly of the Old Bailey. Here, on the wet timber of the pier, the law was just Arnold and two exhausted constables against a surge of bodies that smelled of rain and righteous fury. A woman in a shawl pushed forward, her face pinched with a vitriol that twisted her features into something unrecognizable, spitting a word that landed on Arnold's coat sleeve like acid. "Bitch." He ignored it. He focused on the rhythm of their feet. Left, right, drag, left, right, drag. The chain between Webster's wrists clinked, a tiny metallic heartbeat against the roar of the crowd. A photographer lurched into their path, tripod legs splaying like a dying insect, a magnesium flash pan ready in his hand. "Look here, look at the camera, Mrs. Webster. Give us the face of the devil." Arnold shoved the man aside, his shoulder connecting with the photographer's chest with a solid thud. The flash powder scattered, a cloud of white dust settling on the wet planks, useless now. "Move," Arnold growled, the single syllable carrying enough weight to part the sea of reporters for a fleeting second. He used the opening, driving Webster forward, her stumbling gait matching his urgent stride. The fog curled around them, thick and yellow, tasting of coal smoke and river mud, clinging to their eyelashes, blurring the edges of the shouting faces until they were just shapes in the gloom, mouths opening and closing like fish in a tank. They reached the carriage, a black hansom waiting with the horse stamping impatiently, steam rising from its flanks. The driver leaned down, eyes wide, whipping the reins to clear the space immediately around the wheel. "Get in," Arnold ordered, unlocking the cuffs just enough to allow her to climb, then resecuring them once she was inside, the metal clicking shut with a finality that made her flinch. She curled into the corner, pulling her shawl tight around her head, hiding her face, making herself small, trying to vanish into the upholstery. Arnold slammed the door. The sound was swallowed instantly by the renewed uproar as the crowd realized the bird was caged. He climbed up beside the driver, the leather seat cold and damp beneath him. "To Bow Street," he said, "and drive fast before they decide to stop us." The whip cracked, the horse surged forward, wheels splashing through puddles that reflected the gas lamps flickering to life in the early twilight. Arnold looked back once. Through the rear window of the cab, he saw only the shadow of the woman, a dark huddle against the glass. He turned away, facing the road, the wind biting at his exposed ears. The adrenaline that had sustained him since Wexford began to recede, leaving behind a hollow ache in his joints, a weariness that seeped into the marrow. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the folded letter admitting the missing skull. The paper felt warm from his body heat. He pulled it out, staring at the neat, controlled script. The cranium remains unrecovered. The words seemed less certain now, shaky in the face of the mob's hunger. They wanted a head to put on a spike, a definitive end to the story. They wanted the monster tied up with a bow, the puzzle solved, the fear assuaged. Giving them a trial, without the primary evidence of death, felt like sending a soldier into battle without a rifle. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, the rhythm uneven, jarring his spine. He thought of the bones in the box at the station, the femur polished like soap, the ribs stripped of their flesh. They were silent witnesses. They could not speak of the blow, of the anger of the moment the life went out. Only the skull could have told that story, the fracture patterns speaking the language of violence more clearly than any witness. Without it, the defense would weave a tapestry of doubt. They would suggest she walked away. They would suggest a mistake. They would suggest that the bones belonged to a cow, a pig, some other nameless thing dredged from the mud. "Rain's coming," the driver called back, not turning his head. Arnold looked up. The sky was a uniform, bruised purple, heavy with the promise of another deluge. The fog was lifting slightly, revealing the jagged skyline of the city, the chimneys puffing black smoke into the lowering clouds. London, the city that ate people and digested them slowly, turning flesh into fat and bone into evidence. "Let it come," Arnold said. His voice sounded tired, even to himself. The carriage turned a corner, the wheels screeching against the stone, and the pressure of the crowd faded, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the creak of the suspension. Inside the cab, Webster was silent. He imagined her there, counting the seconds, praying to a god who had seemingly abandoned her in the mud of Ireland and the fog of the Thames. He wondered if she thought of the landlady whose remains she had dissolved in lye. If the face of the woman she had boiled haunted her in the dark corners of the cab, or if she had managed to scrub that memory clean along with the copper pot. He touched the letter again. He would deliver it to the superintendent. He would stand in the dock and present the bones. He would argue the logic of the flesh, the impossibility of a woman walking around without her head. But as the gas lamps of Fleet Street blurred past, streaks of orange in the grey gloom, Arnold felt a cold certainty settle in his gut, heavier than the wet wool of his coat. The trial would be a spectacle. The verdict was far from guaranteed. And somewhere in the black, shifting silt of the river, the skull lay buried, a white stone swallowed by the mud, keeping its silence, waiting for a tide that would never bring it home. The carriage slowed as they approached the station. The gates were open, lanterns swinging in the wind. Constables waited, hands on their truncheons, faces grim. Arnold took a breath, the air thick with the smell of wet horse and coal dust, and prepared to step down into the light. The real work was just beginning. The gas jets hissed, a serpentine sound that fought the heavy silence of the court. Arnold stood near the railing, his boots planted on the worn oak, feeling the vibration of the crowd's shifting weight through the soles. He did not look at the jury. He looked at the tray. 12 pieces of bone, scrubbed until they gleamed with a terrible, chalky whiteness, arranged in a rough approximation of a human form. They looked like butcher's offal prepared for a stew, stripped of meat, stripped of dignity, stripped of the skin that had once held them together. Dr. Phillips had finished. The doctor sat now, wiping his spectacles with a handkerchief, his face pale under the yellow glare. He had spoken of periosteum, of the specific way fire and water interact with calcium, of the impossibility of a dog chewing through a femur in such a clean, surgical manner. The defense counsel, a man with a voice like oiled silk, had tried to pick the bones apart with words. He suggested a shipwreck. He suggested a medical school theft. He suggested anything but the horror sitting in the dock. But the head, Inspector, the counsel had said earlier, his finger pointing an accusing tremor at the empty space on the velvet cloth. Where is the head? Can you identify a woman without her face? Arnold had said nothing then. He said nothing now. The absence of the skull was a hole in the floor of the courtroom, a void into which the defense hoped to throw the entire case. It gnawed at him, that missing piece. It was the loose thread in the tapestry, the one variable that refused to balance in the ledger. Without it, Julia Martha Thomas remained partially a ghost, a woman whose end was written in fragments, but whose final expression was lost to the tide. Then Webster rose. She moved with a strange, jerky energy, as if pulled by invisible wires. Her black dress rustled, a dry, leaf-like sound that cut through the murmur of the gallery. She placed her hands on the rail of the dock, her knuckles white, the skin stretched tight over the bone. She looked at the judge, then at the jury, and finally her gaze swept over Arnold. There was no fear in her eyes. Only a hard, calculating brightness, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished by the weight of the evidence piled against her. "My lord," she began. Her voice was clear, louder than it needed to be, projecting to the back of the room where the reporters sat scribbling in their notebooks. "I have told the truth. Mrs. Thomas left of her own accord. She was tired of this life, tired of London, tired of me. She packed her bags and she went." "She walked out," Arnold murmured, the words escaping before he could stop them, "leaving her silver behind." Webster's head snapped towards him. "She gave it to me, for my trouble, for years of service." "And the coal?" Arnold stepped forward, ignoring the bailiff's slight shift in stance. "You bought coal on the 3rd of March, the day after she supposedly left for France." "I bought it earlier," Webster said, her voice rising, sharpening. "The shopkeeper is a fool. He remembers nothing correctly." "He remembers the rain," Arnold said. "He remembers you arguing over the price because you had no small change. He remembers you carrying the sack yourself, heavy enough to make you stumble." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the receipt, the paper crinkled and stained with grease. He held it up. The gaslight caught the edge, illuminating the date, the amount, the signature of the merchant. "And he remembers the smell. He said you smelled of fat, of rendered fat that clung to your clothes." A ripple went through the room, a low murmur like wind moving through dry grass. Webster's face tightened. The mask slipped, just for a second, a twitch in the cheek, a narrowing of the eyes. Then she smoothed her features, forcing them back into that rigid, innocent line. "Lies," she spat, "all of it. You are all against me. You want a witch to burn, so you make one out of a poor servant girl." "And the trunk," Arnold pressed, his voice dropping, losing its flat monotone, gaining an edge of steel. "The black leather trunk you carried to the station, the one that was light enough for you to lift, yet heavy enough to require 2 men to load it onto the cart when you were caught. What was inside, Kate? If Mrs. Thomas had left, why was the trunk empty when we opened it? Why did it smell of the river?" Webster opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at the judge, then at the jury, searching for a lifeline, a sympathetic face, a crack in the armor of the law. She found none. The 12 men stared back at her, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the tray of bones. They were not looking at the gaps anymore. They were looking at what was there, the femur, the ribs, the vertebrae, the evidence of a body taken apart, piece by piece, in a kitchen no more than a few miles from this very court. The judge began his summing up. His voice was deep, resonant, filling the space with the authority of the law. He spoke of the impossibility of Webster's story. He spoke of the flight to Ireland, the attempt to escape justice. He spoke of the lies, the pawned silver, the coal, the fat. He gestured to the bones. "Look at them," he commanded, his hands sweeping over the tray. 12 men, look at the work of human hands. No animal boils itself. No woman walks away from her own skeleton. The prisoner asks you to believe in a miracle, that a woman vanished into thin air, leaving only her bones behind, scattered in the mud. I ask you to believe in the evidence. I ask you to believe in the truth of what your eyes tell you. Arnold watched the jurors. He saw the moment the doubt died. It happened almost simultaneously in all 12 of them. A shifting of posture, a squaring of shoulders, a collective intake of breath. They looked at the bones, then at Webster, then back at the bones. The missing skull was still a gap, a wound in the case, but it was no longer a doubt. It was a tragedy, yes, but not a reason to let a killer walk. The logic of the flesh was sufficient. The river had kept its secret, but the mud had given up enough. "The prisoner is guilty," the foreman said. His voice cracked slightly, a human flaw in the procedural machinery. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Webster did not cry out. She did not pray. She swayed, just once, a deliberate theatrical listing to the side, her eyes rolling back in a performance of fainting that would have done credit to a stage actress. She collapsed onto the floor of the dock, a heap of black fabric, and feigned unconsciousness. The guards rushed to her, hauling her upright, shaking her shoulders to rouse her for the sentence. Arnold turned away. He adjusted his left glove, pulling the cuff tight over his wrist, the leather creaking in the sudden noise. The verdict was given. The law was satisfied. But as he walked towards the exit, pushing through the throng of reporters eager to file their copy, he felt the hollow ache in his joints return, heavier than before. The ledger was closed. The file was complete, except for the one entry that would remain blank forever. Somewhere in the black, shifting silt of the Thames, the skull of the murdered mistress lay buried, keeping its silence, waiting for a tide that would never bring it home. Arnold stepped out into the cool night air, the fog wrapping around him like a shroud, and walked towards the pavement, leaving the sound of the crowd's roar behind him. He needed a drink. He needed to wash the smell of the court from his clothes. He needed to forget the look in Webster's eyes just before she fell, the look of a woman who knew she had lost, but who would never, ever admit she was wrong. The street was quiet, the gas lamps casting long, wavering shadows on the wet stones. A hansom cab clattered past, the wheels splashing through a puddle, sending a spray of dirty water against the curb. Arnold pulled his coat tighter around him, the wool damp and heavy. He began to walk, his footsteps echoing on the pavement, a solitary rhythm in the vast, sleeping city. He walked towards the river, drawn by the same magnet that had pulled him there for weeks, the same force that had guided his hands through the mud and the slime. He needed to see it one last time. He needed to stand on the bank and look out at the black water, to acknowledge the debt that could never be repaid, the secret that would never be told. The fog thickened as he approached the embankment, swallowing the lights of the bridges, muffling the sound of the traffic. The river was invisible, a presence felt rather than seen, a dark, breathing entity that flowed beneath the city, carrying its secrets to the sea. Arnold stopped at the railing, his hands gripping the cold iron. He looked down into the abyss and waited for a sign, a ripple, a clue that the skull was still there, waiting for him, but there was nothing. Only the water, black and deep, and the silence of the grave. The black flag snapped, a sharp crack against the grey sky, louder than the murmur of the crowd below. It hung there, a square of void stitched to the pole, marking the exact second Kate Webster ceased to be a problem of law and became a matter of memory. The drop had happened moments before, unseen behind the high wall of Newgate, masked by the architecture of justice and the thick, cloying fog that clung to the prison stones like wet wool. There was no cheer when the flag rose. No roar of triumph from the hundreds gathered on the pavement, shuffling their boots in the mud, craning necks for a glimpse of nothing. Just a low, collective exhale, the sound of a held breath finally released into the chill autumn air, followed by the immediate, desperate scramble to disperse. Arnold stood apart from the surge. He kept his hands deep in the pockets of his greatcoat, fingers curling around the cold metal of a pencil case he did not need. The crowd flowed around him, a river of bowler hats and shawls moving away from the execution site, eager to put the horror back into the past where it belonged. They wanted breakfast. They wanted the warmth of a pub, the reassurance of a pint, the normalcy of a day that had resumed its proper course now that the monster was dead. He did not move. His boots felt rooted to the damp cobbles. "Move along, governor," a constable muttered, brushing past with a shove that was more habit than hostility. "Nothing left to see. She's gone." Arnold nodded, a slight dip of the chin that cost him nothing. "Yes, gone." The word tasted flat, ashy. It sat on his tongue like the residue of old tobacco, bitter and unresolved. He watched the last of the stragglers vanish into the mist, their figures dissolving until the street was empty save for the turning of a wagon wheel somewhere in the distance and the rhythmic drip of condensation from the rusted iron brackets overhead. The silence returned, heavy and pressing, filling the space the crowd had vacated. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the silence of a room after an argument, where the words have been spoken, but the anger still hangs in the air, waiting to settle. He turned away from the prison gates. The walk back to the office was short, a mere 10 minutes through the winding lanes of the city, yet it felt like a journey across a vast, uncaring landscape. The fog had thickened since dawn, rolling off the Thames in dense, yellow waves that obscured the rooftops and turned the gaslight's orbs of sickly green. It muffled the sound of his footsteps, swallowing the rhythm of his walk until he felt as though he were moving through deep water, every step an effort against an invisible current. The office was cold. The fire in the grate had burned down to a bed of grey ash, the embers glowing faintly like dying eyes. Arnold crossed the room and shook out his coat, sending a cloud of river mist into the stale air. He hung it on the peg by the door, the wool dripping onto the floorboards with a soft, rhythmic tap-tap-tap. He did not light a fresh lamp. The grey daylight filtering through the grimy window was sufficient for what remained to be done. He sat at his desk. The wood was scarred with ink stains and the circular marks of wet mugs, a testament to long nights and endless reports. In front of him lay the ledger for the Barnes mystery. Thick-bound, leather cover worn smooth at the corners from handling. He opened it to the final page. The ink on the previous entries was dry, the script precise and unemotional, recording the discovery of the leg at Barnes, the trunk at Waterloo, the flight to Wexford, the arrest in Killan. Each line a step, in a dance that had led inevitably to the black flag snapping above Newgate. His hand hovered over the pen. The nib caught the light, a sliver of silver against the dark paper. Conviction, guilty of willful murder. Sentence, death by hanging. Execution, carried out. He wrote the words. The scratch of the nib was loud in the quiet room, a harsh, brittle sound that seemed to violate the stillness. He dated the entry, 29th July 1879. The numbers formed neatly, aligned with the ruled lines, perfect in their geometry. Then he stopped. The next line item waited, recovered remains, below it the subcategory, cranium. Arnold stared at the blank space. The paper seemed to stretch out before him, white and accusing. He could feel the phantom weight of the missing bone in his mind, a hollow sphere that refused to be filled. He had walked the mudflats until his boots were ruined. He had sifted through the slime with his own hands, feeling the slick, soap-like surface of boiled vertebrae, the rough edge of a femur stripped of its flesh, the terrifying lightness of bones that had been cooked in a pot like common beef. He had found everything, every piece of her shattered remains, save the one that held her face, her voice, her identity. The river kept it. A memory surfaced, unbidden. The sensation of the mud sucking at his boots, the smell of rendered fat clinging to the back of his throat, sweet and cloying, indistinguishable from the fog itself. He remembered the moment he realized the head was gone, the sudden, cold certainty that some secrets were too deep for the law to drag into the light. It was a gap in the record, a wound in the case that no amount of procedure could stitch closed. He dipped the pen, the ink welled up, black and viscous. His hand trembled, just once, a minute vibration that traveled up his arm and settled in his chest, a tightness behind the ribs that had nothing to do with the cold. He wanted to leave it blank, to close the book with the question mark intact, to let the uncertainty stand as a testament to the imperfection of justice. But the ledger demanded completion. The procedure required an answer, even if the answer was a negation. He pressed the nib to the paper. Skull not recovered. The letters formed slowly, deliberately, each loop of the S, each cross of the T executed with a care that bordered on the ritualistic. When he finished, he sat back and watched the ink dry, the glossy black fading into a dull matte as it soaked into the fiber of the page. It was done. The file was complete. The woman was dead, the killer was dead, and the record was sealed. Yet nothing felt resolved. The absence of the skull was not just a missing piece of evidence. It was a reminder that the world did not tidy itself up to suit the needs of the police, that some things were lost forever, swallowed by the dark, shifting silt of the Thames, beyond the reach of warrants and handcuffs. Julia Martha Thomas remained incomplete, her story ending not with a period, but with an ellipsis that stretched out into the muddy deep. Arnold closed the ledger. The sound of the cover shutting was final, a heavy thud that echoed in the small room. He ran his hand over the leather, feeling the grain beneath his palm, the cool smoothness of a job finished. He stood up, his joints cracking in the silence, and walked to the window. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, thinning enough to reveal the jagged line of the rooftops against a sky that was slowly turning from gray to a bruised purple. The rain had started, a fine, cold drizzle that streaked the glass and blurred the view of the street below. He watched a single drop trace a path down the pane, winding its way through the grime until it disappeared into the sill. He turned back to the desk, picked up his hat, and placed it on his head. The brim was damp from the earlier walk, the felt heavy against his forehead. He reached for the gas lamp and twisted the valve. The flame hissed, shrinking to a pinpoint of blue before vanishing entirely. Darkness rushed in to fill the room, soft and absolute. He moved towards the door, his footsteps quiet on the floorboards. As he stepped out into the corridor, the smell of the office faded, replaced by the scent of wet stone and coal smoke. He walked down the stairs, out into the street, and pulled his collar up against the drizzle. The air was cold, biting at his exposed skin, but it was clean. The cloying, greasy scent of rendered fat was gone, washed away by the rain, leaving only the sharp, metallic taste of the city and the promise of a night that would eventually, inevitably, end. He began to walk, not towards the river, but away from it, letting the fog swallow his figure as he disappeared into the gathering twilight. Rain found the gap between collar and neck, a cold needle pricking the skin where the wool had shrunk from wear. Arnold did not flinch. He let it sting, a sharp counterpoint to the dull, greasy phantom that had haunted his throat for months. The street offered no shelter. Carriages splashed through the gutters, their wheels throwing up sheets of dirty water that hissed against the cobblestones, but he kept to the center of the pavement, walking with a steady, rhythmic gait that ignored the slickness under his boots. Away from the river, always away. He turned left at the junction, moving past the darkened windows of the chandler's shop, where the scent of tallow candles usually triggered a reflexive tightening in his chest. Tonight, the smell was just wax and dust. The fat was gone. Or perhaps, finally, his nose had stopped hunting for it. The distinction mattered less than the result. The air tasted of wet coal and horse manure, honest filth that belonged to the living city, not the submerged dead. A constable stood under the awning of a public house, shaking water from his cape in great, shivering arcs. The man straightened as Arnold approached, hand lifting to the brim of his helmet. "Inspector." "Carry on, Miller." "Bad night for it, sir. The damp gets into the bones." Arnold paused. He looked at the young constable, whose face was flushed pink from the cold, eyes bright with the nervous energy of a man who still believed the uniform made him invincible. "It does," Arnold said. His voice sounded rough, unused since the ledger closed. "But the bones are quiet enough, usually. It's the rest of us that ache." Miller blinked, the smile fading into a confused frown. "Sir." "Nothing. Get under cover, man. You're shaking the rain onto the step." Arnold moved on before the constable could formulate a reply. He did not look back. The interaction felt like a stone dropped into a well, waiting for a splash that never came. He preferred the silence. It matched the emptiness in his pocket where the notebook used to sit, the one filled with measurements of femurs and vertebrae, the inventory of a woman boiled down to soup. "Skull not recovered." The words sat in his mind, stark and white against the gray twilight. They were the final entry, the period at the end of a sentence that made no grammatical sense. How could a story end without a head? How could justice claim to be whole when the victim remained fragmented in the mud, her face lost to the silt, her identity reliant on the testimony of her ribs? He passed a group of men huddled near a gas lamp, their faces illuminated in brief, flickering bursts as they lit clay pipes. Smoke curled up into the drizzle, mixing with the steam rising from their shoulders. "Did you see the flag?" one asked, his voice carrying over the hiss of the rain. "Black as pitch, she's gone." "Served her right," another muttered, spitting into the gutter. "Boiling a body like a joint of beef. Unnatural." "Unnatural," the first man repeated, sucking on his pipe. "Though I heard the head never turned up. Reckon the river took that one for itself." Arnold's stride hitched, just for a fraction of a second. The heel of his boot slipped on a patch of wet moss growing between the stones, and he had to shift his weight to stay upright. He recovered instantly, smoothing his coat lapel with a hand that felt suddenly large and clumsy. They knew, of course they knew. The details of the Barnes mystery had fed the penny dreadfuls and the evening papers for months, chewed over in pubs and parlors until the horror was diluted into gossip. But hearing it spoken so casually, tossed between strangers like a coin, stripped the case of its solemnity. It was no longer a tragedy or a procedural triumph. It was entertainment, a story with a missing chapter that the public filled in with their own gruesome inventions. He walked faster, the rhythm of his steps accelerated, clicking sharply against the stone, a frantic tempo that fought against the slow, dragging pull of his exhaustion. He wanted to shout at them, to tell them that the missing skull wasn't a puzzle for their amusement, but a failure of his own hands, that he had sifted every ounce of that black sludge, that he had felt the smooth, soap-like curve of every other bone, and still, the most important piece had slipped through his fingers. But he said nothing. He kept his gaze locked on the road ahead, where the fog thickened into a solid wall, obscuring the street lamps further down until they were nothing more than hazy halos of yellow light. A hansom cab rattled past, the driver hunched under his oilskin, reins slack in his hands. The horses' hooves clattered, a hollow sound that echoed off the brickwork of the terraced houses. Arnold stepped closer to the wall to let it pass, pressing his shoulder against the cold, damp masonry. The stone seeped through his coat, chilling the bone beneath. "Going far, Governor," the driver called out, pulling the horse to a halt as he noticed Arnold's hesitation. The animal snorted, steam billowing from its nostrils in thick white clouds. "No," Arnold said, "just walking. Rain'll get worse before it gets better. You'll catch your death. I'm already dry enough." The driver shrugged, a jerky movement of his shoulders, and clicked his tongue. The horse moved on, the wheels groaning as they rolled over the uneven cobbles, fading into the mist until the sound was swallowed entirely. Arnold stood alone again. He took a breath, deep and slow, filling his lungs with the cold, wet air. He waited for the smell of fat to rise up from his own clothes, the cloying sweetness that had clung to him since March, invading his home, his bed, his food. He sniffed his sleeve. Nothing, just wet wool and the faint, acrid tang of the gas lamps. It was gone. The realization landed softly, without fanfare. There was no surge of relief, no sudden lightness in his step, just a quiet, hollow acknowledgement. The scent had left him, but the absence remained. The skull was still missing. Julia Martha Thomas was still headless in the ground, her final resting place marked by a gap in the earth that no amount of dirt could fill, a dark mouth waiting for a jaw that would never return. He resumed walking. The street narrowed here, the houses leaning in towards each other as if whispering secrets across the alleyway. Shadows stretched long and thin, distorted by the fog, turning familiar doorways into gaping mouths. He navigated them by memory, his feet knowing the way even as his mind drifted. A cat darted across the path, a streak of ginger fur that vanished into a coal chute. The sound of its scramble echoed briefly, then silence returned, heavy and complete. Arnold reached the corner where the road dipped towards the Thames. He stopped. The instinct was strong, a magnetic pull that urged him to turn right, to follow the slope down to the water's edge, to stand on the mudflats and stare into the black current until his eyes burned. He could go there. He could walk the line of the tide one last time, searching for a bone that wasn't there. He turned left instead. The decision cost him nothing physical, yet it felt like lifting a weight he had carried for half a year. He walked away from the river towards the safety of the main roads, where the traffic was heavier and the lights were brighter. The rain intensified, drumming against his hat, running in rivulets down the back of his neck. He welcomed it. Let it wash everything away. Let it scour the streets, the buildings, the people, until nothing remained but the clean, cold stone. His footsteps slowed as he approached the intersection. A woman stood under the shelter of a shop front, wringing out a handkerchief, her face pale and drawn in the gloom. She looked up as he passed, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting second. "Evening, Inspector," she said softly. He stopped. He didn't know her. She was just a face in the crowd, another soul trying to stay dry in a city that never stopped weeping. But she knew him. They all did in this part of London. The man who found the bones, the man who couldn't find the head. "Good evening," he replied. His voice was steady. "Keep out of the wet." "We all have to go somewhere, don't we?" She smiled, a thin, brittle expression that didn't reach her eyes, "even when there's nowhere to go." Arnold nodded. He had no answer for that. He tipped his hat, a mechanical gesture, and stepped out from under the awning, back into the rain. He walked on. The fog closed in behind him, erasing his path, blending the street into a uniform grey void. There was no triumph in the closed ledger, no peace in the execution of the killer. There was only the walk, the rain, and the long, slow fade of a case that would never truly be finished. The river kept its secrets, and Arnold, finally, was learning to let them go. The sound of his boots faded into the mist, a rhythmic tapping that grew quieter with every step, until the street was empty, and the only thing left was the rain falling on the stones, washing them clean over and over again. The Boiling House is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. American State Trials, a collection of the important and interesting criminal trials which have taken place in the United States from the beginning of our government to the present day. Internet Archive. Murder of Julia Martha Thomas. Jonathan Hyde. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.